Hi, and thank you for listening in on my talk on Mary Shelley's apocalyptic fantasy, The Last Man. The novel was published in 1826 and sees a futuristic world, aka the end of this century, in which a deadly plague, alongside varying and hostile climates and weather, ensures the extinction of mankind, all but one last man, Lionel Verney. It seems entirely appropriate this year that Shelley's novel is getting the recognition it deserves, as we perhaps enter the end of the world as we know it. I'll be discussing the parallels we share with this uncanny novel and its themes and influences. Thank you. Firstly, a word about myself. I'm Katherine and I'm a third year PhD researcher at the University of Huddersfield. My research explores representations of cold and hostile weather in British Romanticism, and that includes a chapter on Mary Shelley's apocalyptic novel. Now I'll quickly give an overview of the novel. It's futuristic, and it's set at the end of this century, and as humanity resides in a world that they have outgrown, a deadly plague seeks the end of humankind. The novel's protagonist, Lionel Verney, suffers great loss as he slowly loses his family and friends, leaving him the last man on earth. Lionel's journey of loss does biographically represent Mary Shelley's own experiences of loss. By the time Shelley had come to write The Last Man in 1824, she had lost several children to disease, her husband Percy Shelley drowned at sea, and Lord Byron died from a fever. Shelley identified herself in a journal entry as, quote, "the last man," writing that, yes, I may as well describe that solitary being's feelings. I feel myself as the last relic of a beloved race, my companions extinct before me. End quote. The Last Man, until recently, has quietly lingered in the background when thinking about the literary works of Mary Shelley. When we think about her, we are often directed towards her pioneering novel Frankenstein, a novel so prescient that it remains important today, especially in film, television, and theatre. This, of course, includes a recent episode of Doctor Who, in which the Doctor travels back to 1816 in the Villa Diodati, finding Mary Shelley, Lord Byron, and Mary Shelley's stepsister Claire Clairmont. Here the Doctor searches for Percy Shelley, who has mysteriously vanished. The Doctor acknowledges that the weather the group experienced that year, which had been a factor in Shelley writing Frankenstein, was in fact the aftermath effects of the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia. The impact of this eruption was so devastating it reduced the Earth's temperature by 3 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit. Ash and pumice in the air led to a blackout year, otherwise known as the year without a summer. With this, harvest failures caused death and famine, and disease followed. This year not only influenced Shelley in writing Frankenstein, but also influenced how she would write about the weather in The Last Man. As England becomes increasingly colder, the remaining survivors are forced to flee and retreat to the safety of the Swiss Alps. The weather in The Last Man is really quite apocalyptic, as it appears as the novel progresses to work in coalition with the deadly plague to ensure mankind's extinction. The winters are freezing and hostile, and during the warmer months the plague appears to be at its very worst, manifesting and spreading in a way unknown to Lionel Verney and his friendship circle. Shelley's novel followed a series of publications, of which had contemplated the last man theme, which depicts the end of humanity and also the end of the universe. The first of these emerged in France in 1805 and was written by cousin de Granville and entitled Le Dernier Homme. This text was a year later published anonymously in England in the English language and didn't appear to be a great success with the general public. However, in 1816, inspired by the torrid and apocalyptic weather, Lord Byron would write his poem Darkness, which sees the end of humankind in perpetual darkness. And then later in 1823, Thomas Campbell published his poem The Last Man, which had a similar concept to Byron's poem earlier. However, what Shelley's contribution to the Last Man theme does is it offers an insight into life without humanity, without humankind, and presents this as idyllic and desirable. And this is really what my research points towards, that throughout the text there is a human versus earth fight for survival, but not only for survival, but for a paradise also, in which the earth succeeds in for the animal and inanimate landscape. Plague in the novel is the most apparent figure of death. However, throughout, Shelley cleverly demonstrates her thorough knowledge of hostile weather and natural disaster, as she mixes natural phenomena such as black suns, earthquakes, and storms with cold and hostile climates, and also the plague, to give a wider perspective on what natural factors contribute to human suffering and death. In addition to this, while you'd think that Lionel and his group of friends, some of which hold political power, would make plans to work towards the prevention of the plague and also preempting the dangers that may arise naturally, they don't. They instead discuss plans for globalization. They seem convinced that in a future world, at least 100,000 years away, the Earth would become a paradise as a universal spring is produced, and mankind would live blissfully and harmoniously. But unfortunately, this does not happen, and soon the plague invades England and overruns the country. In addition to this, the weather becomes so bizarre. For example, dangerous streams are frozen in one moment, and in another are rushing so ferociously it becomes a real danger to life. The temperatures drop so cold that the characters cannot leave their homes for more than a few moments, and exposure to the cold becomes very problematic for Lionel and his friends, eventually forcing them to flee to the Swiss Alps, where the plague claims its last victim and vanishes. But what happens after the plague claims its last victim? Lionel and the remaining survivors, Adrian and Clara, are travelling across the sea when a fierce storm overcomes them. Adrian and Clara are lost to the sea, leaving Lionel the last man on Earth. Lionel spends many days contemplating his last man figure and decides to move to Rome, where he may be surrounded by what he calls man's greatest achievements. This is reiterated by Shelley through Lionel on multiple occasions, that Lionel is often struck with the feelings of despair and waste as man's achievements and successes being wiped away by the plague and the overgrowth of nature and the natural. He arrives at Rome with the hopes of finding solace and peace in the prospect of being surrounded by reminders of human succession and monuments. He perhaps achieves this to some extent, but Lionel, as the sole survivor of his kind, there is nothing he can do but give way to the naturally overrun, new and perhaps better world. Ultimately, Shelley's novel remains relevant nearly 200 years on from it being first published. It is perhaps now more relevant than it has ever been before. The varying and ever increasingly dangerous climate, the killer plague wiping out the human race, human expansion and globalization ever increasing, and the Earth as seen to enact this plague as to restore her healthy balance of life and sustainability seems especially relevant now. I think the time is now right to look back to Shelley's novel and expose it with the recognition it deserves. We should be reading it and asking the complicated questions. Is Shelley's dooming text a vision of our own futurity, or wrapped up in the concerns of her own period? Thank you.